Ah, Halo. Again. Science fiction has a strong showing in video games, rivaled only by its cousin fantasy. Why? Because they mesh so well with the underlying concept of a video game. When you're escaping into a new world, why settle for something mundane when you can have space warriors duking it out on alien fortresses? Like we saw last week, the Halo games in the main trilogy have no problems pinging the grand space opera aspect of science fiction. But sometimes, in the middle of a titanic battle to save the galaxy, there are smaller stories to be told about the guys who keep the world turning with unsung sacrifices. Bungie knows this, as they are often hailed as master storytellers. Though last week we saw that doesn't always hold up under fire. Now we're returning to the Halo universe to cover Bungie's last two additions to the franchise, Halo 3 ODST and Halo Reach. While together they don't cover nearly as much ground as their main trilogy counterparts, what these games say is no less important.
You know the music, time to dance.
I'm your host, James Tabor, and today I'll demonstrate how good gameplay can be anathema to good narrative. I'll start off with a simple point. ODST and Reach are the same story, or at least the same type of story. You might have heard this before in your life, but there are two kinds of story, a plot story and a character story. It's a gross oversimplification, but it boils down to whether the focus of the story is on the events unfolding in the story or the people who instigate it. Virtually all of the games we've covered so far have been plot stories. Technical limitations usually force video games to favor plot over character, but there are some exceptions. The two most prevalent are either RPGs, which have had a good character focus for most of their long tenure, and recent games that take advantage of new technology and changing attitudes to try something different. That something different is what Bungie attempted with these two games, but their success depends on which game you're looking at and how. ODST follows the Rookie, a member of a lost squad of normal human soldiers. The game focuses on his attempts to piece together what happened to his team. It involves traversing the city of New Mombasa, looking for clues and either engaging or avoiding Covenant occupiers. As you find clues, the viewpoint shifts to follow your squad mates from several hours earlier as they struggle to reunite and complete their mission. Reach, on the other hand, follows a Spartan super soldier similar to the Master Chief, and deployed on the title planet of Reach. As part of a team, you operate in several theaters of war, culminating in a mission that ends up kicking off the events of the main trilogy. So how are these character stories instead of plot stories? Both make use of plots, as all narratives must, but you might be wondering how the focus is shifted onto the characters. The answer? In both games, the ending is a foregone conclusion. Reach is a prequel that takes place before the events of the first Halo game. Throughout the series, and in the expanded universe, we hear about Reach as a place where something really terrible happened. In ODST, as a matter of fact, you can find the words "Remember Reach" scrawled on the walls of New Mombasa. Also, the games make reference to the Master Chief as the last surviving Spartan, so we know things aren't looking good for the protagonists from the very beginning. This leaves us wondering exactly how these terrible events unfold. A quick side note here, I'm aware that the expanded universe novels and comics conclusively prove that the Chief is not, in fact, the last surviving Spartan. However, for the sake of expediency, and so the show doesn't end up as video game literature, we're going to be taking the games as their own enclosed canon for the time being. By doing so, all the backstory of the games work together without contradicting the events as portrayed elsewhere. As for ODST itself, it's more of an interquel, explaining what happened on Earth during the events of Halo 2 that took place on Delta Halo. Again, by Halo 3 we know that New Mombasa was destroyed to unearth a Forerunner artifact beneath it, but we don't know the exact story. This has the same effect as Reach. Since we're assured of the greater outcome, we can focus on the smaller, more personal details. But that's still only part of it. It's called a character story for a reason, so the character arcs have to be good enough to carry the narrative despite the weaker plot element. In ODST, the Rookie doesn't talk. Ever.
What was your name again? Inside, now.
He's what we call a silent protagonist, the sort of literary device that can only work in a video game. By not talking, the character has less explicit personality, and is therefore a fertile ground for the player to project his or her own personality onto the character. It's a good connection mechanism as it makes the stakes more personal for the player. It's also similar to Halo's mainstream protagonist, the Master Chief, though he still spoke during cutscenes. He's more of a quiet protagonist, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The Rookie's silence also serves to emphasize two key points: the sense of loneliness as you sneak through an abandoned city, and the personalities of the other soldiers when you transition into one of their scenes. Your sergeant and squad mates all talk freely during both cutscenes and gameplay, carrying on dialogue and shouting one-liners as necessary.
This grid is packed with Covenant. Be careful.
I appreciate the concern.
Won't be much of a rescue if you're dead.
Obviously, the rookie can't arc, since being a mute avatar means he doesn't make any decisions, let alone making them himself. He's essentially a static character, the same kind of Watson character we've discussed before. But what about the others? Buck is the squad leader and a jaded veteran. Romeo is a wisecracking sniper. Dutch is a god-fearing death machine. Mickey is the soft-spoken pilot. Captain Dare is the enigmatic intelligence officer assigned to the squad at the last minute. Romeo, Dutch, and Mickey are all good characters, but their purpose is to flesh out the squad and so don't develop much. Neither do Buck and Dare on their own, but together they form a romance arc. True, it's said in the game that they have a history together, but aside from some small anecdotes and vagaries, it's never elaborated.
Remember, that night? What you asked me in the morning?
I remember not getting an answer.
At the beginning of the game, Buck makes it clear he's going to look out for his squad rather than follow Dare's mission. But by the end, he's changed his mind to the point that he's willing to go back into the dangerous city they spent all night escaping in order to find her.
Why?
I lost something. Now I know where to find her.
It does end up being tied back into the mission, but there are clearly some personal benefits as well. It may not look like it, but Dare has another important role to play. She's a non-villain antagonist for the squad. The opening cutscene shows her hijacking the squad from their original mission in order to fulfill her own objectives. In other words, she gets in the way of the hero's plans, the textbook definition of an antagonist. Furthermore, the conclusion of the game only happens once the player confronts her deep below the city. But because she's not a villain, the confrontation isn't violent in nature, but instead the fulfillment of her original mission, and the last piece of the puzzle required to escape. There's also a case to be made for Virgil, the municipal artificial intelligence of New Mombasa turned into a Covenant engineer. Actually, you know what? That sentence pretty much makes its own case for a change in character. So that's a character story with plenty of character. Now let's talk about Reach. It's similar to ODST, in fact. You play as Noble 6, the latest addition to Noble Team. Unlike the rookie, however, 6 is a quiet protagonist in the same vein as the Master Chief. He has his own lines of dialogue, but only in cutscenes. Now, the game lets you choose whether or not you're male or female and changes the dialogue accordingly, but for ease of conversation, we'll be using male pronouns. Your teammates are Carter, the boss, Kat, the overly curious information specialist, June, yet another wisecracking sniper, Emile, the violent close combat specialist, and George, the big guy. They all have their own characterizations, but for the most part, they remain taciturn and serve as invincible AI allies during gameplay. Their moments to shine come through in cinematics. Did I say shine? I meant flicker uncertainly like the lights on a powerless submarine sinking into an underwater trench. The truth is that the story is incredibly weak, with every moment reeking of wasted potential. The various levels in the game are only connected by the thinnest threads of justification. ODST made use of an overworld and clue-seeking mechanics to enrich its story, but there's nothing like that in Reach. As a result, the characterization in the game suffers noticeably. One of the issues is the lack of an antagonist. There's some good potential to be found in the first level. You encounter elite zealots, one of whom escapes with valuable data recovered from an archaeological dig. There's also Shara, a civilian girl with no love for the military, whose father was the head researcher at said dig site. But neither of them are ever mentioned again. Then there's Dr. Halsey, the progenitor of the Spartan program. She shows some early promise of being a non-villain antagonist like Dare, but she only appears in 2 levels, one near the beginning and the other close to the end. Another problem is that the story seems to have gotten so caught up in the fall aspect of Reach that it forgot it was supposed to focus on character. Rather than have any meaningful interaction or dialogue, after the 4th level, we're left with what Yahtzee of Zero Punctuation calls a who can have the noblest death competition. So with all that in mind, do any of these characters actually arc? It's weak, but yes, and in the case of one character, you have to be familiar with the background material. We'll focus on her first, actually. In the beginning of the game, Kat treats Noble 6 with an extremely cold shoulder. She's terse and almost cruel, clearly upset at his presence. Why? Well, if you read her character profile on Bungie's website, you discover that the current Noble 6 is a replacement for the previous one that was killed in action. In fact, he was KIA while undertaking a mission plan that Kat herself put together. She blames herself for your predecessor's death, and so sees you as a constant reminder of how she failed him. Could that have been mentioned in the game? Absolutely. I'd go so far as to say the fact that it wasn't is a huge failure on the part of Bungie's writing team. This arc is resolved close to the end of the game, shortly before Kat's death. After helping with the evacuation of a city under siege, Kat and Noble 6 work together to take down several communications jammers. She acts as mission control while you do all the heavy lifting. At the end of the mission, she admits,
Noble 6 were one still I expect.
During the end cutscene, it's clear that you've proven yourself in her eyes. When you have to evacuate the building, you share an elevator. She even gives you some encouragement for the first time ever. Then she dies. The other arc is with Noble 6 himself. During the opening cutscene, Carter tells you to leave the lone wolf stuff behind.
But we're a team. That lone wolf stuff stays behind.
Implying that your character never worked well with a team. Then, at the very end of the game, after most of your team has fallen, Captain Keyes thanks you for a job well done. Your response?
Not just me, sir. They'll be remembered.
Is that a good enough arc? 6 does exhibit some lone wolf tendencies, but mostly while under orders or without an alternative. But if you're willing to read between the lines and do some imagining on your own, the arc is there. So how do these two games stack up as literature? We glazed over setting for both of them, but there's not much to be said. Both stories rely on their respective settings, having been well established in the universe already. But does the narrative surpass the gameplay? ODST has a good case, since the overworld mechanic allows the player to choose the order in which they handle the flashback scenes. It also forces the player to survive in the city without any particular objective or support. Reach doesn't have a good case, but it does have a case. It allows you to customize your Spartan character, essentially making Noble 6 completely into the player's avatar. You can change your appearance and even your sex, which, as I mentioned before, changes the dialogue. Whether or not the narrative is surpassing the gameplay strongly is up to personal taste. In my mind, they only barely make the cut, but they still make it. But there's still a divide there. ODST is a much stronger game across the board than Reach. So why is it that two games made by the same developer and following the same basic premise are so different in execution? The difference is multiplayer. Ever since online multiplayer became such a hit, every game in recent memory has had some online component to feed the masses. The Halo franchise is one of the worst offenders, probably because it was the first game to make it popular on consoles. Halo 2 single-handedly pioneered Xbox Live's competitive online system, and since then, Halo has set the standard for operation. For good reason, too. It's really fun. But if you'll recall, Halo 2 had its fair share of problems. The most jarring of them was the missing ending, the third act that never came. Now, I don't have any facts to back this up, but if I had to guess, I'd say that implementing online multiplayer, and the pressure the franchise is under to maintain that superiority, is what's taking a serious toll on story development. Remember how Halo 3 had a much weaker story than its predecessors? The game had a serious multiplayer component. It's conceivable to me that Bungie settled for a terrible story in order to satisfy the market's growing appetite for online matchmaking. ODST didn't have that sort of expectation, as it was originally meant as an expansion for Halo 3 rather than the standalone game it became. Its only multiplayer mode was Firefight, which was cooperative in nature and didn't use matchmaking software. The result was a much more robust story experience that was closer to the fun and wonder of the first Halo game than the other games. Now compare that to Reach, which had expectations of being heavy on the multiplayer, and suddenly the story sucked again. In the end, we have to ask ourselves what's more important to us, story or multiplayer? You know where I stand, seeing as how the entire show revolves around narrative in gaming. But what about you? Would you rather have an intense story experience or an extreme multiplayer component? Remember, it's your taste and your decisions that determine the future of the market. Next week, we're heading to Gotham to examine everyone's favorite Dark Knight. Until then, game hard and game safe. A is not a number.
Cha number
He is a writer, he knows these
with
things.
A. Statistic race.
Thanks for watching. The discussion continues in comments below, so feel free to join us. If you like our show, please like and subscribe. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter, or even send us an old-fashioned email.